I spent 20 years keeping secrets for my country, surviving war zones and making life or death calls. But the most dangerous blind spot I ever had was the man I was going to marry. He thought I was just a low-level pencil pusher. Tonight, I was going to show him exactly who commands the room. If you had asked me a year ago how a seasoned military strategist could misjudge a civilian so completely, I would have laughed. My entire career was built on threat assessment, reading people and neutralizing risks before they materialized. I am Major General Sarah Jenkins. I've commanded thousands of troops, overseen multi-billion-dollar defense budgets, and advised the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But when it came to Greg Thompson, I was completely, embarrassingly blind. I met Greg during a rare, quiet weekend in Georgetown. I was in civilian clothes, a simple cashmere sweater, and jeans, enjoying a momentary escape from the high-pressure cooker of the Pentagon. He was wearing a custom Italian suit, aggressively charming, and had a smile that could disarm a bomb. He worked as a senior vice president at Crestview Dynamics, a massive tech and defense contractor. When he asked what I did for a living, I gave him the same sanitized answer I gave anyone outside the blast radius of my security clearance. I work for the Department of Defense. Mostly logistics and supply chain management. It wasn't a lie. Moving battalions, orchestrating drone deployments, and managing international military assets is logistics. But Greg's eyes glazed over the moment I said Department of Defense. In his world, the government was a sluggish bureaucracy filled with underpaid clerks who pushed paper while private sector titans like him pulled the real strings. "Ah, civil service," he had said, signaling the bartender for our drinks. "Safe, reliable, good benefits, I'm sure. It's cute that you're doing your part, Sarah." I should have walked away right then. But Greg was a breath of fresh air. He didn't want to talk about global conflicts, classified intelligence, or the crushing weight of leadership. He wanted to talk about art, wine, and his ambition. For a woman who spent her days making decisions that kept people alive, Greg's sheer blissful ignorance of my reality felt like a vacation. We dated for 8 months before he proposed. By then, the cute little government job narrative was set in stone. I rarely wore my uniform outside of Fort Myer or the Pentagon. My aide, Captain James Miller, knew to call my personal cell only in absolute emergencies when I was off duty. Greg never saw the salutes, the heavy security details, or the deference I commanded. To him, I was just Sarah, his sweet, unassuming girlfriend who probably spent her days ordering printer toner for men with stars on their shoulders. The real trouble started when I met his mother, Beatrice Thompson. Beatrice was the matriarch of a wealthy Great Falls family, a woman who measured human worth in country club memberships and corporate titles. The first time Greg brought me to their sprawling Virginia estate for Sunday dinner, I was subjected to a polite but vicious interrogation. "So, Sarah," Beatrice said, delicately slicing her prime rib, "Greg tells me you work in a cubicle over at the Pentagon. Is there room for growth there? Or is it one of those jobs where you just wait for a pension?" "I have a fair amount of responsibility, Mrs. Thompson," I replied evenly, keeping my tone mild. "I'm quite satisfied with my trajectory." Beatrice exchanged a knowing, pitiful glance with Greg's older sister, Caroline. "Well, that's nice, dear. Not everyone is built for the pressure of real leadership. Greg, on the other hand, is managing a $50 million portfolio this quarter. Isn't that right, sweetie?" "$60 million, Mother," Greg corrected, puffing his chest out slightly. He reached over and patted my hand condescendingly. "But Sarah keeps things running. Someone has to make sure the troops have boots and blankets, right?" I smiled tightly, taking a sip of my wine. At that exact moment, my division was finalizing a covert operation to extract high-value assets from a hostile region in the Middle East. I was running on 4 hours of sleep and a river of black coffee. But I bit my tongue. Operational security is drilled into you from day one. You don't brag, you don't boast, you serve. But the disrespect didn't stop with his mother. As Greg's career at Crestview Dynamics ramped up, so did his arrogance. His firm was aggressively bidding on a massive, highly classified military contract, Project Sentinel, a next-generation drone surveillance network. Greg was obsessed with it. Landing this contract meant a promotion to the C-suite. One evening, he invited me to a dinner with his firm's senior partners, Richard and Thomas, at a ridiculously overpriced steakhouse in D.C. They spent the first 2 hours heavily drinking and loudly complaining about the morons in the military. "These generals," Richard sneered, waving his martini glass. "They don't know the first thing about tech. They sit in their padded chairs and reject our bids because they don't understand the algorithms. We're pitching the future, and they're still trying to fight the Cold War." Greg laughed loudly, trying to impress his bosses. "Exactly. I swear, the military brass are just glorified politicians who couldn't cut it in the private sector. It's a miracle they can tie their own combat boots." He looked at me, realizing I was sitting quietly. "No offense, babe. I know you like your boss and your little department, but you have to admit, the bureaucracy is a joke." "Actually," I said, my voice dropping a terrifying octave, the tone that usually made colonels snap to attention. "The military procurement process is designed to prevent untested, volatile technology from getting our soldiers killed. It's not about fighting the Cold War. It's about ensuring that when a system fails, the blood isn't on a contractor's hands, it's on the commander's." The table went dead silent. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback that the admin assistant had an opinion. Greg's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. He leaned in, gripping my thigh hard under the table. "Okay, Sarah, let's not pretend you understand the complexities of multi-tier defense contracts. You track shipping manifests." Right then, my secure phone buzzed in my purse. A priority message from General David Hawk Reynolds, a 4-star who mentored me. "Need you in the skiff. Situation developing." I stood up, dropping my napkin on the table. "I apologize, gentlemen. I have an emergency at work. I need to leave." Greg looked furious. "Are you kidding me? We're in the middle of dinner. What kind of supply emergency could you possibly have on a Friday night? Did someone lose a pallet of toilet paper?" "Something like that," I said coldly. I walked out, leaving him fuming. I spent the next 48 hours in a secure bunker, managing an international crisis. Greg didn't text me once to ask if I was okay. He only texted to tell me I had embarrassed him in front of his partners. The turning point happened 3 weeks later. Despite the friction, the wedding planning continued. I was exhausted, pulling double duty between my actual life and the facade Greg expected me to maintain. But the professional side of my life was thriving. I was officially confirmed for my 2nd star. The promotion to Major General was a massive milestone, placing me in command of a newly formed Joint Forces Technology Integration Task Force. Ironically, my first major duty in this new role was overseeing the final review of the Project Sentinel bids. The exact contract Greg's company was dying to win. Because of the classified nature of the reorganization, the public announcement of my promotion was delayed. However, I was slated to be the keynote speaker and the guest of honor at the Armed Forces Joint Charity Gala, a highly exclusive black tie event held at the Omni Shoreham Hotel. It was the premier event of the season for defense contractors, military brass, and DC elite. One evening, I came home to the upscale apartment Greg and I shared in Arlington. I found him pacing the living room, frantically barking orders into his headset. He ended the call and let out a triumphant shout, spinning around to face me. "We got a table," he grinned, practically vibrating with excitement. 10 grand a seat, but Crestview bought a whole table for the Armed Forces Gala next weekend. "Oh?" I said, slipping off my heels and setting my briefcase down. "This is it, Sarah," Greg said, pouring himself a scotch. "Word on the street is that the Pentagon just appointed a new 2-star general to head the Sentinel Committee. We don't know his name yet. It's completely locked down. But he's going to be at this gala. Richard and I are going to corner him, buy him a drink, and lock this contract down." I stared at him, my heart doing a slow, heavy thump. Greg, just assumed the new commander was a man. Of course he did. "That sounds ambitious," I said carefully. "It's how business is done," Greg lectured, pacing again. "You have to get in front of the decision makers. You wouldn't understand, being so far down the totem pole. But this is the big leagues, and I need you to come with me." "You want me at the gala?" "Yes," he said, walking over and holding me by the shoulders. He looked me up and down with a critical eye. But listen to me, Sarah. This is incredibly important for my career. The room is going to be filled with four-star generals, senators, and CEOs. It's not your usual office crowd. I know what a military gala is, Greg, I said softly. Do you? He chuckled patronizingly. Look, just dress elegantly. Nothing too flashy. I need to look like the stable, reliable executive. And please, if my partners or any of the VIPs talk to you, just smile and nod. Don't try to debate them on government policy like you did at the steakhouse. Just tell them you do data entry for the DoD and leave it at that. I don't want you sounding out of your depth and embarrassing us. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect washed over me like ice water. I looked at the man I had agreed to marry. For months, I had made excuses for him. I told myself he was just driven, that he was simply caught up in the corporate rat race. But the truth was staring me in the face. He didn't respect me. He thought I was inferior, a nobody whose only value was looking pretty on his arm while he schmoozed the real important people. I won't embarrass you, Greg, I said, my voice eerily calm. I promise. I will wear exactly what is appropriate for a woman of my station. Good girl, he smiled, kissing my forehead. Oh, and my mother is coming. Crestview gave her a ticket. Try to stay on her good side, all right? The following week was a blur of high-level briefings. My aide, Captain Miller, was working overtime to coordinate my security detail and speech for the gala. Ma'am, Miller said on the afternoon of the event, standing at parade rest in my Pentagon office, the motorcade will be ready at 1,800 hours. The Chief of Staff will be waiting for you in the green room before your introduction. Thank you, Miller, I said, looking at my freshly pressed dress blues hanging on the door. The heavy gold epaulets gleamed. The 2 silver stars pinned to each shoulder caught the light. The rows of ribbons, Bronze Star, Defense Superior Service Medal, Legion of Merit, spoke of decades of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Is your fiancé riding with us in the command vehicle, ma'am? Miller asked. No, I replied, a small, cold smile playing on my lips. Mr. Thompson has decided to travel separately. He has networking to do. At our apartment, Greg was a nervous wreck. He was adjusting his bow tie in the mirror, sweating profusely. I have to leave now to meet Richard for pre-drinks, he told me, looking at his watch. Are you almost ready? You're taking forever. I was in the guest bedroom, the door closed. I'll take an Uber, Greg. I'll meet you there. Fine, he huffed through the door. Remember what I said, Sarah. Keep a low profile. Stay at the table with my mother until I come get you. Do not try to talk to any of the brass. This night is about my promotion, okay? I'll see you tonight, Greg, I answered. I heard the front door slam. I stepped out of the guest room, walked over to the full-length mirror, and began to dress. I buttoned the midnight blue tunic. I adjusted the collar. I pinned my medals to my chest. For a year, I had made myself small to fit into Greg Thompson's world. I had swallowed insults, smiled through belittlement, and let him treat me like a footnote in his grand corporate autobiography. But tonight, there would be no hiding. Tonight, Greg was going to find out exactly who he had been patronizing. I stepped out of the building where my security detail and 2 black SUVs were waiting. Captain Miller opened the door for me, saluting sharply. Good evening, General. Good evening, Miller, I said, sliding into the back seat. Let's go meet my fiancé. The Omni Shoreham Hotel was a fortress of glitz and tactical security. As our motorcade bypassed the main valet line and slipped into the secured subterranean VIP entrance, the contrast between my 2 lives had never been sharper. Upstairs, the ballroom was swarming with defense contractors, lobbyists, and politicians holding champagne flutes. Down here, Secret Service agents and military police stood at rigid attention. Captain Miller hopped out of the SUV, opening my door. Clear all the way to the green room, General, he said. We moved through the service corridors, a tight formation of heavy security and crisp uniforms. I didn't head down to the main floor. Instead, I was escorted up to the VIP mezzanine overlooking the grand ballroom. The space was reserved for the evening speakers, the Joint Chiefs, and high-ranking officials. I took a moment to stand by the velvet-draped balcony railing, looking down at the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. It didn't take long to spot the Crestview Dynamics table. They were situated near the front, a prime location that Greg had boasted cost them $10,000 a seat. I could see Greg perfectly. He was holding court, aggressively networking with a one-star brigadier general who looked desperate to escape the conversation. Greg's mother, Beatrice, was seated at the table, draped in pearls and looking profoundly bored, occasionally sipping her champagne and judging the dresses of the women walking by. Richard and Thomas, the senior partners who had mocked the military at the steakhouse, were busy scanning the room like hawks, no doubt hunting for the elusive new two-star general they needed to bribe with their charm. My phone vibrated in my clutch. It was a text from Greg. "Where are you?" The opening remarks start in 20 minutes. "Mom is getting annoyed. Tell me you didn't take the metro." I watched him from the balcony as he aggressively tapped on his screen, a scowl on his face. I typed back calmly. "I'm already inside, sitting with some important people. Don't worry, I won't embarrass you." Down below, Greg looked at his phone, scoffed, and shoved it back into his tuxedo pocket. He leaned over to say something to his mother, who rolled her eyes. I knew exactly what they were thinking. Sarah had managed to get lost, or she was hiding in a corner somewhere, too intimidated by the wealth and power in the room to show her face. "Enjoying the view, Sarah?" a deep voice rumbled behind me. I turned and smiled. General David Hawk Reynolds, the 4-star commander who had mentored me for the better part of a decade, walked over with a glass of sparkling water. He looked impeccable in his dress uniform. "Just taking the temperature of the room, sir," I replied. Hawk chuckled, looking down at the crowd. "Half this room is here to celebrate the armed forces. The other half is here to sell us something. I hear Crestview Dynamics is making a very aggressive push for the Sentinel contract tonight. Have their executives cornered you yet?" "Not yet," I said, my voice smooth, though my pulse ticked upward. "But I have a feeling they are going to be very surprised by the new head of the task force." "Good," Hawk said, his expression sobering. "We need absolute integrity on this project, Sarah. Sentinel is too critical to hand over to a bunch of corporate suits who prioritize profit margins over troop safety. That's why the committee unanimously chose you. You don't get bullied, and you don't get bought." "Thank you, sir," I said. "I intend to make that abundantly clear tonight." A stage manager with a headset stepped into the green room, looking nervously at the heavy brass assembled. "Generals, we are 5 minutes out. If you could please make your way to the backstage holding area." Hawk offered me his arm. "Ready to make some waves, Major General Jenkins?" "Always, sir," I replied. I took one last look down at table 14. Greg was adjusting his cuffs, smiling brightly at a passing senator. He was completely in his element, ready to conquer the world, oblivious to the fact that his world was about to collide with mine at terminal velocity. The ballroom lights dimmed, cutting off the low roar of 1,000 simultaneous conversations. A single spotlight hit the grand stage. The United States Army Band played a flawless rendition of the national anthem, followed by a hushed, respectful silence. The Master of Ceremonies stepped up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, please welcome the Commander of the United States Army Forces Command, General David Reynolds." Thunderous applause echoed through the cavernous room as Hawk walked out onto the stage. Down at table 14, I knew Greg and his bosses would be sitting on the edge of their seats. Hawk was the gatekeeper to billions in defense spending. I stood in the wings, hidden by the heavy black curtains. Captain Miller stood rigidly behind me, holding my briefing folder. "Tonight, we are here to honor the relentless dedication of our men and women in uniform," General Reynolds began, his voice booming over the sound system. "But we are also here to look toward the future. The landscape of global security is shifting. To meet these new threats, the Department of Defense has authorized the creation of a specialized Joint Strategic Technology Task Force, overseeing our most sensitive next-generation integrations, including Project Sentinel. I could hear a collective shift in the room. This was the moment the contractors had been waiting for. The official announcement. Commanding this task force requires an individual of uncompromising grit, razor-sharp intellect, and an absolute dedication to the warfighter, Hawk continued. This officer has spent 20 years managing complex logistical networks in hostile theaters, executing covert extractions, and protecting the lives of our soldiers. It is my profound honor to introduce the newly appointed commander of the task force, and a newly minted 2-star general. Hawk turned toward the curtains where I was waiting. "Please welcome Major General Sarah Jenkins." The applause started, polite but eager, as I stepped out from the shadows. The spotlight hit me, illuminating the gold braid on my sleeves, the 2 silver stars gleaming fiercely on my shoulders, and the colorful rows of decorations on my chest. I kept my posture ramrod straight, my chin leveled, and my steps measured and authoritative. I walked across the stage, feeling the collective eyes of 2,000 people on me. But I was only looking for one face. As I reached the podium and shook General Reynolds' hand, I looked directly down at table 14 in the front row. The color had completely drained from Greg Thompson's face. He was frozen, his mouth literally hanging half open, his eyes wide with a mixture of utter disbelief and mounting horror. Next to him, Beatrice had dropped her champagne flute. It shattered on the carpet, but she didn't even notice, her jaw slack as she stared at the nobody who did data entry. Richard and Thomas, the men who had mocked my intelligence over stakes, were staring at me as if they had seen a ghost. Richard looked from me to Greg, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, as the realization of who I was and what Greg had done set in. I adjusted the microphone, resting my hands on the podium. I let the silence stretch for just a second longer than comfortable, asserting absolute command of the room. "Thank you, General Reynolds," I started, my voice echoing off the walls, crisp and uncompromising. "When I was first commissioned, a senior officer told me something I have never forgotten. He said, 'The military is not a business. In a business, when you fail, you lose money. In our line of work, when you fail, you lose lives.'" I paused, letting my eyes sweep the room, briefly lingering on the Crestview table. Greg looked physically ill. He was sinking into his chair. "As we move into an era of unprecedented technological reliance," I continued, "the partnership between the armed forces and the private sector is more vital than ever. But let me be perfectly clear. This task force will not tolerate vanity projects. We will not be swayed by slick presentations or corporate arrogance." I stared directly at Richard and Thomas now. "We demand systems that work. We demand partners who understand the gravity of our mission. Accountability is not just a buzzword to us. It is a matter of life and death. If you want to sit at our table, you will respect the uniform, you will respect the process, and you will respect the men and women who bleed for this country." The applause that erupted was deafening. It wasn't polite golf claps. It was a roaring ovation from the military brass in the room who were tired of corporate double talk. I delivered the rest of my speech flawlessly. When I concluded, I gave a sharp salute, turned, and walked off the stage. The real theater, however, began during the post-speech reception. General Reynolds, Captain Miller, and I stood in the VIP section of the ballroom as a line of senators, CEOs, and commanders came up to shake my hand. I handled the political maneuvering with ease. Then I saw them approaching. Greg was being physically pushed forward by Richard, who looked like he was ready to commit a murder. Beatrice trailed behind them, looking entirely shell-shocked. When they reached the front of the line, Captain Miller stepped forward, imposing and unsmiling. "General Jenkins, these individuals are from Crestview Dynamics." "Thank you, Captain. I know who they are," I said coldly. Richard forced a terrified, sycophantic smile. "General Jenkins, wow, what an incredible speech. We had no idea that the woman you called a glorified politician who couldn't tie her own combat boots was the commanding officer evaluating your $50 million bid." I cut him off, keeping my voice low but razor sharp. "Yes, Richard, I imagine that is quite a surprise." Richard visibly swallowed hard, shooting a lethal glare at Greg. Greg stepped forward, his arrogance entirely shattered. He looked like a frightened child. "Sarah, babe, why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think you were just an admin?" "I never lied to you, Mr. Thompson," I said, using his last name like a physical blow. "I told you I worked in DoD logistics. I told you I had responsibilities. You chose to fill in the blanks with your own arrogance. You looked at a woman who quietly did her job and assumed she was beneath you. You needed me to be small so you could feel big." Beatrice clutched her pearls, her voice trembling. "Sarah, dear, surely we can talk about this. Greg loves you. And this." This misunderstanding shouldn't affect business, should it? I turned my gaze to Beatrice, the woman who had sneered at my cubicle job. Mrs. Thompson, there is no misunderstanding, I said evenly. Your son demonstrated a catastrophic failure in judgment, a total lack of character, and a profound disrespect for the very institution he is begging for money. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the 2-carat diamond engagement ring Greg had given me. I held it out. We are done, Greg, I said, dropping the ring into his shaking palm. Pack your things and be out of my apartment by tomorrow, 1700 hours. If you are not gone, military police will assist you. Greg looked at the ring in his hand, tears of humiliation welling in his eyes. Sarah, please, my career. Your career is your problem, I interrupted. I looked back at Richard and Thomas, who were sweating through their custom suits. Gentlemen, Project Sentinel will be awarded to a company that respects the gravity of national security, not a firm that treats it as a punchline over martinis. Have a good evening. I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked away. The sea of tuxedos parted for me, officers saluting as I passed. I had spent a year playing the invisible fiancé, but as I walked out of the Omni Shoreham that night, the cold Washington, D.C. air hitting my face, I had never felt more seen. I was Major General Sarah Jenkins. I commanded the room, I commanded my life, and I was finally free of the dead weight. And that's how you execute a flawless tactical retreat from a toxic relationship. Greg lost his fiancée, his pride, and single-handedly tanked his company's $50 million defense contract all in one night. Never underestimate the quiet ones, they might just be running the whole operation. If you loved this story of absolute karma and reality-checking arrogance, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs a reminder to know their worth, and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories.